So the reading is taken from Ruth, and it's the whole of chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "Daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for." Now, Boaz, with whose woman you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put your perfume on, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law had told her to do. Then when Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant, Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good. Let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured it into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law Naomi, asked, How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today."
Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your word to us. It is a light for our path. It is food for our soul. May it be so for us this morning. Amen. This is an exciting chapter. We are continuing in our Lent journey through the book of Ruth, and I don't know about you, but I'm enjoying it. If you mean by enjoyment, I am feeling provoked, challenged, comforted, intrigued, inspired, and pursued. Ruth has even been the topic by sheer coincidence of the Lectio 365 readings this week for those who use that tool. And so we've had a number of opportunities to enter into the story over these last little while. And in the end, that's the essence of what the Lord is asking us to do in this moment and in this reading, to enter into his story. Ponder that phrase for a moment. Our task is to enter God's story, which sounds like a really good spiritual thing that a vicar might say. Enter God's story. Just going to get rid of this for a second. But it's actually much more real than that. By way of example, this week Jill and I had one of those moments when we realised that we haven't properly talked to each other for a while. Busyness here, exhaustion there, we were passing like ships in the night, and then there was this moment. Jill was about to walk down from the house of prayer, having met with some students who are hungry to pray, and I had finished researching commentaries on midrashic frameworks for expounding the text of Ruth from a Jewish point of view. Mine was better. And so having concluded this enjoyable experience, I decided I would walk up as she walked down, and we went to the pub and we had a pint and we talked to each other. And like in any good relationship, it was a talk which included an invitation into the story. This is what I can see, we said to each other. This is the story I'm living at the moment. This is how my past experiences are backing up and interacting with my current moment. So let me share that with you, and you share with me. Let's enter into each other's worlds once again. Let's enter into our story, and so allow your perspective to be adjusted by my perspective and vice versa, so that together we might be shifted, changed, broadened, and awakened to each other. Does that make sense? God's posture is similar. It always has been. By his providence, he has enabled his story to be written down. And by his Spirit, he enables his story to be opened up before us. And the invitation to enter into his story is to allow ourselves to be moved by his perspective, adjusted, shifted, changed, broadened, and awakened. And it's similar, and as a similar aspect of his loving commitment to us. Our Lord is not a closed book. He shares himself, he shares his story, and he meets us in the dark and says, let's talk. And that's partly what we're doing at the moment. For the story of Ruth, it's twofold. Not only is the Lord present in Ruth's moment, and we're reading about that, the Lord is also present with us as the descendant of Ruth and Boaz. And so this truly is his story. He's asking us to go, what can you see? So let's look into it, what's going on in this story. Well, in this week, we could be excused for thinking that the story is getting a little romantic. But before we turn it into a Mills and Boon novel, or start one of those, let me tell you a story while I'm putting on my makeup TikTok reels. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Let's take a step back and take in the whole view. See, what we're not going to see in this story today is the story about breathless lovebirds running into each other's arms in the warm breeze under a harvest moon, even though we might like that. Apart from anything else, Ruth and Boaz are not teenagers in this story. Ruth is a widow, so likely well into adulthood, and Boaz is older, at least the next generation above her. Some traditions even have Ruth at the age of 40 and Boaz at the age of 80, with a corollary that he dies on his wedding night having performed his duty. But that's probably overplaying it and using symbolic numbers to make a point. But certainly we're not talking about, teenage love. And more than that, the issues at stake in this story are not about things like fluttering heartbeats and potential loneliness. This is not set in the Twilight universe where there's a damsel asking, "Oh, will he bite me or will I be alone forever?" This is not that story. In fact, this sort of calculus for working through things like romance and marriage are actually quite modern things. Rather, the issues at stake here are a lot more practical. This society that Ruth lives in is like the vast majority of societies that have existed and exist across time and space. They do not revolve, first and foremost, around individuals or even around nuclear families, but around extended families, clans and tribes. Because individuals simply do not survive in worlds like this. Nuclear families are not able to provide everything they need for themselves. To flourish in Ruth's world, and I suggest it's actually the same more than we think in today's world, you need to belong. You need to be connected in, to be embraced by a larger whole. And so while by the end of this story, the outcome is a wedding, the intention at the beginning of this moment is much more practical, even robust. Naomi is concerned for her widowed daughter-in-law's long-term well-being. My daughter, she says, I must find a home for you, a place to be connected in, a place to belong. And in the original language, and the NIV has a footnote that says this, so I'm not being nerdy about Hebrew, it reads literally, my daughter, I must find rest for you, a place for you to be able to rest, a home, a household. And that's a good word. Rest in Hebraic thinking speaks of the flourishing that we're talking about here, that sense of belonging. Eden, the Garden of Eden, is a place of rest. Sabbath is a time of rest that looks back to the paradise of Eden and looks ahead to the restfulness and the shalom peace we have in God's kingdom coming. Rest is about an existence that doesn't depend on striving and affliction and pressure and frenetic obligation. It can only in the end be a rest that is found in belonging to God, and within that, belonging to each other. And this is what Naomi longs for Ruth. And so she looks not so much for a husband for Ruth to have, or a husband for Ruth to be had by, but for a household for Ruth to be a part of. You see, within the social framework of that time, there was a sense of mutual obligation. We're going to pick this up next week when we look at the whole concept of kinsman redeemer. But what it comes is that there's this sense of obligation for caring, especially for the widows and orphans, the ones who have become disconnected from the larger whole, so that people aren't left out in the cold. And depending on who you were, you might find yourself with an expectation to care for and to include, to have a duty of care for those to whom you are related. You might find yourself as a guardian redeemer to your close relatives. And Boaz is at least close to being one of those for Ruth. And so it makes sense. Naomi, as she calculates her plans for Ruth's well-being, and given that Ruth has had an experience with Boaz, like we looked at last week, which is a one of benevolence and trustworthiness, Boaz is a good man, then why not? He's a relative of ours. How do we take the passing respect that you, Boaz and Ruth have had, and turn it into something more substantial? This is the matter at hand. Does this make sense? Right? Good. So Naomi's plan involves Ruth going to the threshing floor during at the end of the harvest, and therefore aligning with one of the harvest festivals, one of those sacred celebrations when God's provision through the land is celebrated. And the likelihood is that this festival that being celebrated is the festival of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. And it marks a moment in the harvest which aligns with the story. It's a festival that is a number of weeks after Passover. That's how you count it. And Passover, of course, commemorates the time when God's people left slavery in the land of Egypt and commenced their journey, which would eventually end with them crossing the Jordan and entering into the promised land, a bit like Ruth has just crossed the Jordan and entered into the promised land. But of course, after Passover, a few weeks after Passover, the people of God arrive at the Mount Sinai, where they receive the law. And so the Festival of Weeks, the Feast of Weeks, is not just a harvest festival. It commemorates this time when God meets with his people at Sinai and gives them the law. And it therefore has a nuptial theme. It actually aligns with what Ruth and Boaz are doing. Because at Sinai, it's where it's considered within some of the Jewish imagery that God marries his people. That's where they enter into a covenant, you see, a covenant of faithfulness. So you have this imagery hanging over this feast. It's also for us the feast that we later come to know as Pentecost, when the same Spirit that overshadows the waters of creation and also overshadows the mountain of the Lord and then also overshadows the womb of Mary fills the followers of Jesus with potency and fruitfulness. So there's this covenant nuptial theme running through the atmosphere in this moment. And remember, there's this theme that we've been following: God's chesed love, covenant loyalty, his deep and joyous faithfulness. And the harvest festival that's happening in this moment is right with it. There's this beautiful alignment of meaning that's running through the threads of the story we're meant to be entering into. Am I the only one who's excited about this? So during this festival full of pregnant nuptial meaning, Naomi sends Ruth down to the threshing floor, the place where the festival is happening, with instructions on how to approach Boaz. And at some point out that there is a brazenness to what Ruth has been asked to do. Well, there's certainly a boldness to it. Ruth is certainly pushing against and crossing some lines of good behaviour. She is risking ruining her reputation. But this isn't some flirtatiousness. Remember, there is a foundation of trust in the friendship between Boaz and Ruth that we saw last week. And when Ruth does make her move and goes and lies down at the feet of the sleeping Boaz, and after he is startled awake, her request isn't, "Oh, Boaz, take me." That's not what she's on about. It's back to the original concept. Cover me, she says. It's not that she's cold. She's asking for inclusion. Cover me, bring me under your roof. Don't just look out for me in the field. I wish for a more substantial place of belonging. Cover me. So yes, Ruth has chosen a risky path. She's acted vulnerably. Boaz could have accused her of all sorts of things, but she has acted decisively and assertively at Naomi's urging, and Boaz certainly considers it to be honourable. One tradition has it that Boaz was a widower without children, and in his old age he faced the end of his line. He was a kinsman redeemer for Ruth, but Ruth is just as much offering redemption to him than he to her, to form with him a mutual home for their mutual rest. And once again, there's this alignment between this story and God's chesed love for his people. There is no coercion here. There is just trust, entrusting to each other, faithfulness in the character of both. Ruth is acting towards Boaz the way God would have his people act with him. Not timidly, not fearfully in sense of terror, but not presumptuously either, but with trust and hope and a desire to find our home with him. And Boaz is acting in the way that God would have had his people act in his name, not with condescension, but with integrity and delight and gentleness. And we could stop right here as we enter this story, and have this as our take-home point for the day. Be bold in seeking our home with God, like Ruth. Take a risk with him. Trust in him. Go to him vulnerably. We could take home this desire to imitate both Boaz and Ruth in our spirituality, to be exhorted in this story to act on the basis that God actually loves you. You'd be amazed at how your perspective changes when you enter into that story. God does actually love you and is towards you with integrity. You can allow that to percolate. It's amazing what that simple truth does. But there's one more detail that I think is worth pointing out. Ruth spends the night covered by Boaz, and then in the morning, Boaz sends her home carefully and discreetly, because he knows what wagging tongues might say if it was known that the woman, the Moabite woman, had come to the feast and spent the night. And Boaz's intention is clear. He has responded to Ruth. He wishes to embrace her, but he has some legal things to attend to. We'll get to that next week. But the other thing he does is he measures out 6 measures of barley and says, you can't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. And there's some deep significance in that action. Firstly is in the number 6. 6 measures of barley. 6 days the Lord laboured in creation, and on the 7th day he rested. So he is sending back 6 measures, the fruits of the labour. It's a message that says, your labour has ended. Now enter into your rest. Enter into your home. Enter into your household. And once again, you can hear the heart of God. In the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 3, it speaks of the household of Jesus, his home. And then in chapter 4, it uses this language. It says this: there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, to be a part of his home. So surely that eternal rest that God offers us is an eternal rest. It lasts forever. But it's not an eternal rest in the sense that it doesn't start until the hereafter. Our eternal rest starts now as we belong to Christ's home, to his household. That starts now on a real day, on a day that's called today, as Hebrews says. The second meaning is this: in this gift of barley to Naomi through Ruth, there is another extension of grace. You see, Naomi is also running a risk here. At the beginning of this episode, Ruth is connected to Naomi. Naomi's hope is that Ruth would now be connected to a home that would last for longer. But where would that leave Naomi if that actually happened? Naomi's running the risk of being yet again bereaved, left by herself. And Boaz's gift is not a gift to Ruth, it's a gift to Naomi through Ruth. And so he is offering her an assurance. Whatever covering he is going to offer Ruth, he is going to include Naomi in that. The Hesed covenant loyalty is being reflected and extended and to embrace her. After years of grief and turmoil, Naomi will also have her rest. And so in this episode, you also see a story that speaks of God's abundant generosity, a desire to embrace us as well. One might argue that the arrangement between Ruth and Boaz is at least somewhat transactional. She gets covered, has a place to belong. Ruth gets to have someone to have babies with. Yet it's not really a quid pro quo. It's actually more extensive. The transaction is, I'll give you all of myself and receive all of yourself. and vice versa. How do you do the calculus of that other than call it love? Certainly this is the invitation of Jesus. I have given you all of me, now let me cover all of you. But there's transaction there a bit. But the inclusion of Naomi is simply sheer grace. It's a gift. It amplifies God's love. And often when we see that as part of the story, we find ourselves resisting it. Something in us wants to be embraced by God, but only because he owes us something. If he owes us, then we can hold him to it. We can control him in some way. We still want that sort of autonomy in our story with him. It's like the parable of the workers that Jesus tells about those who work the whole day and some who only work the final hour, but at the end they all get paid the same. It's not fair, some complain. It's not on my terms. But the point is that how do you measure generosity? By fairness. Abundance doesn't scale. God's love doesn't scale. It simply is in all its fullness. And so God's grace-filled love is towards us. He doesn't offer us inclusion and belonging because he owes us, but simply because he loves us. And it's his delight to respond to trust, heart to heart, self-offering to self-offering, dying to self so that we might live for him, laying down whatever we have to lay down as we resist him or what he gives us. So that's the story before us. A festival held on the day when God married his people, both at Sinai and in the upper room at Pentecost, and in which these two ancestors of Jesus, and therefore our spiritual ancestors, embrace and embody that cosmic scaled fact and proclaim it even to us today. And it comes back to, how do we want to enter into that story? How will that perspective change us? Do we want to be covered by Jesus? Do we want to go it alone? Are we content to labour in our own strength, doing our best to have God owe us something? Or will we boldly, brazenly, vulnerably, trustingly act like Ruth and offer ourselves? Will we be like Boaz and respond faith to faith and cover and hold with whatever the Lord has given us? Or will we be like Naomi and simply receive the abundant outpouring of his grace? This is the story that we're invited to enter into. And we can then see that it's not just some fable, but a perspective that the Lord is inviting us to consider. In this moment, in this day, in this season, shall we enter into and know his rest, his name, his belonging, his protection, and especially in these troubled times. Will we trust him and bear much fruits for his glory as we bear his name? So I'm going to leave it there. I've talked a long time. We're going to head towards celebrating something covenantal this morning as we share in a feast that speaks of that story. But in the end, it comes down to, where are you at? How would you like to participate?